Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Namaste and welcome students. On behalf of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, Ahmedabad, I, Dr. Deep Trivedi, welcome you to this MA online classes. And we will be having a discussion on paper 3, that is Western Literary Criticism, and within that, block 4, that is Aristotle's Poetics in general. Now, we have already had a discussion on Plato's major arguments, or rather I should say his attack on poetry on 3 different grounds. And we did try to understand how exactly Plato tried to put his concerns regarding his ideal republic into our previous dialogue. Today, friends, we discuss what are Aristotle's views. I mean, as we all know, Aristotle was Plato's disciple, and he also happened to bring about details on poetry in general with number of comprehensive arguments. So let us try to understand what Aristotle tried to discuss and elaborate through the Poetics. Aristotle discusses poetry both in general and in specific way, and he also considers the effects of poetry on those who consume it and the proper way in which to construct a poetic plot for maximum effect. Aristotle's Poetics seeks to address the different kinds of poetry, the structure of a good poem, and the division of a poem into its component parts. Students, he also defines poetry as a medium of imitation that seeks to represent, or rather I should say duplicate, life through character, emotion, or action. Aristotle defines poetry very broadly. Rather I should say, he tried to include almost all the forms like epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, and even some kinds of music. According to Aristotle, tragedy came from the efforts of poets to present man as nobler or better than they are in real life. If we talk about comedy, then on the other hand, it shows comparatively a lower type of person and reveals humans to be worse than they are in average. Epic poetry, on the other hand, imitates noble men like tragedy, but only has one type of meter, which is unlike tragedy, which can have several and number of narrative forms in general. So he explores each component part of poetry separately and also addresses number of questions that come up in the process. So we can say that Aristotle has quite comprehensively delivered his concerns with reference to literature in general, because as we know, poetry was a common noun referred to literature. And Aristotle starts with the principle of poetry, which he says is only natural. He enumerates the different types of poetry like epic, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, as I conveyed earlier, and also music by pipe or lyre, the musical instruments that it would generally accompany through. Additionally, if we say, he claims that all poetry is a form of imitation that only differs in 3 ways: its medium, its object, and or its mode of imitation. So this distinction we have to emphasize upon while we try to understand Aristotle through the Poetics. The medium of imitation depends on the kind of art. Say, for example, a painter or a sculptor uses color or shape as a medium. To take the note of reference, that a painter or a sculptor uses number of colors or even shapes to bring about an idea into its actual image. The way the painter or sculptor embosses the image successfully, whereas a poet uses the medium of rhythm, language, and melody. So each of which can be used alone or together to create some desired effect. You see, literature has a purpose, and that we all know in general, that is to bring about joy and pleasure. So there is always some purpose. To take for one example, we refer to the word pleasure. So to create some desired effect, poetry refers to some amount of imitation, and that is generated through a number of effects. The object is the thing that is imitated in a work of art. In this case, in a poem, objects which include people or things and events, they can be either admirable or inferior, or meaning that objects are either morally good or morally bad. Lastly, an object's mode of imitation is the way in which an object is imitated. In epic poetry, an object is imitated through narration. However, in tragedy, an object is imitated via actors on a stage. And Aristotle argues that human beings have a natural proclivity for imitation, and since humans learn lessons through imitation from the very young age, the human beings maintain that people have a strong tendency to imitate people and things. So that is something natural that comes as very much a part of flow to someone's nature. Furthermore, people take pleasure in viewing distressing images from a safe distance, such as a stage. The pleasure people feel in viewing an imitation is in large part due to understanding. A person views an imitation and also recognizes the thing being imitated and finds pleasure in this understanding. Aristotle further argues that human beings also have a natural proclivity for rhythm, melody, and so it is no wonder they tend to create imitations like poetry, which usually relies on language that has both rhythm and melody. Tragedy was born from dithyrambic poetry, which incorporates both poetry and dance. From there, tragedy evolved into what it is in Aristotle's time, which he refers to as tragedy's natural state. That is how he terms it. That is tragedy's natural state. Comedy imitates inferior people. You see, Aristotle claims, but such characters are not inferior in every way. So that doubt needs to be cleared. And characters in comedy, they are guilty of laughable errors, and that is how comedy is produced. However, such errors, when we talk about comedy, do not elicit painful emotions in the audience. A comedy does not imitate pain, and it should not provoke these emotions in others. Conversely, tragedy and epic poetry imitate admirable people, but epic uses only verse and is in narrative form. So this is the difference between tragedy and epic. And plainly put, an epic does not involve song, and it is usually told through the lens of a single character narration. Epics are usually long, whereas a tragedy is often restricted to the events of a single day. Those who have a firm understanding of tragedy will also have a firm understanding of epic. As everything present is epic, is also present in tragedy. So there is great amount of resemblance in the treatment of both the genres. However, all that is present in a tragedy cannot be found in an epic poem. According to Aristotle, a tragedy is an imitation of an admirable action, right? And that has unity and magnitude, which is found nowhere. And tragedy is written in language that has rhythm and melody, and it is performed by actors, not by narration. So there is an effect that comes through even performances. It's not mere narration, but it comes through the performance. So most importantly, tragedy purifies the audience by producing in them the emotions of fear and pity in a process known as catharsis. A tragedy has 6 components. They include plot, character, diction, reasoning, spectacle, and lyric. Poetry and these components, they determine a tragedy's quality. The very essence comes through these 6 major elements. Plot, if we talk about, is the most important component part of a tragedy. Tragedy imitates actions, not people, and these actions are the events that make up the plot, and plus the most effective way in which a tragedy produces catharsis is through recognition and reversal, which are both part of the plot. A tragedy must be whole, that is, it should have a complete experience, and it must have a definite beginning, an effective middle, and a convincing end. A tragedy must have magnitude, that means it must have to produce astonishment in the audience, but its imitation cannot be arbitrary or random. If the action being imitated in a tragedy is too big, or rather too small, the entire plot cannot be appreciated at once, and unity is forfeited. An imitation has unity if it represents a complete action, and the same goes for plot. A plot is only unified if it imitates a complete action, and poetry does not imitate what has happened. Aristotle argues it imitates what would happen. As long as it is probable or necessary, that is fulfilled. So historians and poets are not much different, because one writes in prose and one in verse. They are different because the former writes what has happened, while the later, that is a poet, writes what would happen. So that is the major difference in the general perception, how we distinguish history and even literature. Even if all historians wrote in poetic verse, the writing would still not be considered poetry. It is a poet's job to make plots, and those plots can include the sort of things that has happened. Since the sort of thing that has happened is likely to happen again, that maturity is offered through tragedy. So it is not enough for a tragedy to simply imitate a whole action. The imitation must also provoke in the audience the emotions needed for catharsis. And catharsis is most effectively produced through events that are unexpected. Every tragic plot involves a change of fortune, and such plots can be either complex, let's say, in which a change of fortune involves recognition, reversal, or maybe both. Or simple plot can be there, in which a change of fortune does not involve recognition or reversal. A reversal, if we try to understand, is a change to the opposite in the actions being performed, which of course occurs because of necessity or probability. That is in a way that seems likely and that follows logically from the story's previous events. Recognition is a change from ignorance to knowledge, disclosing either a close relationship or enmity on the part of the people marked out for good or bad fortune that is expected, that is solicited. The best plot, according to Aristotle, is the one in which recognition and reversal occur at the same time. So as they do in Sophocles' Oedipus the Rex, recognition combined with reversal, that involves the emotions of pity and fear, which are the very foundation of tragedy. And either good fortune or bad fortune will be the outcome of such a combination. Tragedies that involve human suffering, such as in war, are also effective in bringing about what do we call catharsis. The best tragedies, according to Aristotle, they are those with complex plots. A good, effective tragedy should not depict an overly moral character undergoing a change in fortune from good to bad, as this upsets the audiences and does not inspire fear and pity. Similarly, an overly wicked character should not undergo a change of fortune from bad to good, as such a change isn't tragic and will not inspire fear or pity either. Still, a good tragedy does not, it does include a change in fortune from good to bad. As such, plots are more tragic than plots that end in good fortune and will therefore elicit more fear and pity. Tragedy includes acts that are terrible or pitiable, and these acts can occur between people of a close relationship, uh, say, for example, members of the family, and between the enemies or between the neutrals. So there is maximum fear and pity in terrible or pitiable acts. That is what he says. Between close characters, this effect is generated, such as the murder of one's father or son. We may recall the tragedy that comes through Shakespeare. Take, for example, Hamlet. Aristotle next considers characters within tragedy. He defines four things that go into the construction of a character. The first is goodness, or the moral essence of a character's actions and disposition. A character's imitation must also be appropriate, and it must have likeness or similarity. Lastly, a character must be consistent, and if it is necessary or probable that a character behave in an inconsistent way, they should be consistently inconsistent. Poets should always visualize a plot as they construct the same it so that they can spot inconsistencies and inappropriateness. A tragedy must also have compilation and resolution, and both compilation and resolution that should be constructed with equal care and attention. A tragedy includes reasoning and diction, which can be broken down further into several of its own components, or rather, I should say, component parts, including nouns, verbs, and even utterances. Clarity is most important in diction. As long as there isn't loss of dignity. You see, clear diction includes standard words in common usage. However, using only common words in a poem is unoriginal and inartistic and leads to a loss of dignity. Thus, a balance must be struck between standard words in common usage and exotic expressions which are coined by the poet or are otherwise non-standard. Good poetry uses all forms of diction, especially metaphor and uncommon words. According to Aristotle, objections to poetry usually involve one of the following. Let's say a poem is impossible, irrational, harmful, contradictory, or incorrect. Often, that which seems impossible or irrational isn't as impossible as it may seem, especially since it is paradoxically likely for unlikely things to happen. So this very strange mark of demarcation needs to be understood, friends. Furthermore, that which seems contradictory or incorrect might be an imitation of an object as it should be, or it is thought to be, not as it actually is. In other words, Aristotle easily dismisses each of the usual objections to poetry. People might ask if tragedy is superior or epic, and Aristotle strongly maintains that tragedy is absolutely superior to epic. An epic poem lacks spectacle and lyric poetry, which are a source of intense pleasure. You see, this phrase is used by Aristotle when he says intense, source of intense pleasure. And a tragedy is shorter. So, economy of language and the idea of brevity are well maintained when it comes to tragedy. Aristotle argues that what is more concentrated is more pleasant than what is watered down by being extended in time. So there is no point extending something to the extremes, far extremes, to bring about desired amount of effects. Tragedy can do wonders within a short time span, and that also more effectively. For instance, if Sophocles' Oedipus the Rex were as long as Homer's Iliad, it would be much less impactful. Lastly, since an epic is so much longer than a tragedy, unity in an epic can be difficult to achieve. Because of this, Aristotle considers tragedy superior, and he also argues that it is pity and fear and the subsequent catharsis that really make tragedy superior to epic poetry. So that is the general message which we extract through the Poetics, and a very comprehensive meeting of ideas, comprehensive dialogue of the ideas have come in perhaps the most perfect shape, the way Aristotle happens to put the dialogue before us. Reading the Poetics will certainly bring about effective outcome of understanding while we comment upon literature, and that's how the actual standard discussion on criticism, critical argument exchange, that all started on literature along with Plato. Aristotle advanced the matter and the content in its full sense. So friends, we keep this discussion to this length, and I believe that you will have some idea of what Aristotle has to say in detail when it comes to the Poetics. Thank you very much for being with us. We wish you good luck.